Nice to see you today. This is Brain Factoids for your elucidation and recreation. First of all, we're going to show you a real live dead brain. This is it, the source of all our behavior and thought. When the brain dies, you die with it. It's called the materialist assumption, and it's really the secular science perspective on the brain. And it's not so much an assumption anymore as a highly probable description of how the brain works. There is no evidence of a soul or mind separate from the brain that somehow interacts with it, that contains the essence of you, right? Brain pretty much equals behavior, okay? Despite 3,000 years of wishful thinking by the world's religions and some philosophers, right? There is no evidence that any part of your personality and intellect survived the death of the brain. That whole discussion we're going to have a couple episodes on later, but for now, let's just see how complex a thing the brain really is. Let's get into some brain factoids. Okay. The cells that run brains are neurons and look like cells with thousands of bushy branches on one end and a long extension that sticks away from the cell body to talk to other neurons. How many are there in the human brain? Okay. Well, we'll do a quick comparison. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 3,600 seconds per hour, right? Times 24 hours is about 86,000 seconds per day, times 365 days a year is about 31 million seconds in a year. A 31 with 6 zeros behind it, 10 to the sixth, right? So if you counted one of your neurons every second for an entire year, 1, 2, 3, right? You'd count over 30 million of your brain's neurons, but your brain has about 83 billion neurons. So it would take you another 2,700 years or so to count all the neurons in your brain. That's 10 to the ninth, right? 83 with 9 zeros behind it. The connections, or synapses as they're called, there might be 1,000 or more per each neuron connecting with 1,000 other neurons, right? So if you wanted to count the connections, it might take you over 3 million years. 1, 2, 3. 10 to the 12th, right? Pretty complex structure. For another fun comparison, let's do it by the book, right? If neurons were letters, what would it look like? Well, the average book page is about 350 words. There's about 6 letters per word. So 6 times 350, that's 2,100 words per page. How would you get to 83 billion? Well, it'll take you about 40 million pages. Okay? And at 300 pages per the average book, that's about 133,000 books just to contain one letter representing each one of your neurons. And with at least 1,000 connections or synapses per neuron, you'd need 133 million books to list all your synapses at one letter per synapse. About 40 billion pages. Phenomenal complexity. Now, there's a whole literature in philosophy and religion that talks incessantly of the unfathomable mysteries of the human brain, in particular human consciousness, and how it seems absolutely impossible, right, that mere matter, these tiny wisps of protoplasms, could somehow produce your thoughts, feelings, and a sense of self. Yet, I think we've barely scratched the surface of the brain's complex processing. We haven't counted or mapped all the neurons yet. We haven't counted nor mapped all the synapses. We're working on it. So maybe all that complexity could be up to the task of producing consciousness all by itself. And as far as I'm concerned, that is an empirical question yet to be determined. Mapping neurons and synapses is but one level of complexity. There's structural areas in the brain, there are functions and interconnections. There's 40 plus neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin that you've heard of. They have excitatory, inhibitory, modulation functions, okay? It's pretty wild when you think about it, okay? So let's do another little comparison here. Here's a little brain model we got, and you can see your cerebral cortex all squiggly on the outside, right? Here's a baby aspirin, okay? Inside that baby aspirin of cortex, okay, is over 120 million neurons just in that baby aspirin, okay? So let's look at this 2 to 3 millimeter cortex. Slice through it, okay? That outer gray band you see in the image curving around and in and out, that's your cortex, right? Nice sliced picture of this little model. And here's a close-up showing the complexity of those cortical neurons and other interconnections. Again, inside our little baby aspirin worth of cortex, there's 120 million neurons, each with thousands of connections, all firing dozens of times per second, maybe 30 times a second when they're at rest, 100, 200, 300 times a second when they're busy. When you get to the level of molecules, chemical reactions go pretty fast, okay? And we can try to image that activity with fMRI. Most of you know what an MRI is. Regular MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, is a snapshot of your body and brain, and we use magnetism and radio waves, and I'll talk about that in a later episode. Plus, I've got a great link to a Physics Girl episode that explains MRI and fMRI. The F stands for functional. We can look at brain activity or function in real time now with fMRI. It's phenomenal. So let's take a look at what an fMRI can show us about all that activity. Here's a typical fMRI image showing areas of higher activity in red. Okay, it's really measuring the differences in blood flow, inferring more activity and more functional. It's a phenomenal imaging tool. I probably will leave that in there. I like leaving the clams in. Yet 1 pixel of that fMRI image is about the size of that baby aspirin of cortex. So 1 pixel in the fMRI image isn't looking at 1 neuron or 100 neurons or a column of 1,000 or something. It's looking at 120 million neurons, okay? And billions of firing events in the second or two of activity within that 1 fMRI pixel. So as incredibly informative and useful as fMRI is, it's orders of magnitude removed from individual or even small groups of neuron activity. We've got a long ways to go. We have just begun investigating the complexity of the brain. And as another comparison, maybe we are only where Galileo was in the early 1600s in first describing just the most surface features of gravity and how it works, right? To figure out how gravity really worked took from Galileo in the early 1600s to Newton in the late 1600s to Einstein in the early 20th century. It took over 300 years of investigation to get to Einstein and his general relativity explanation of gravity. You think the brain could maybe take a little longer? Like I said, it's only 150 years since we figured out the early structure and function of the actual brain, mid-1800s. Only 50 years of modern neuroscience with CT, MRI, fMRI, cognitive neuroscience, and sophisticated computer modeling. It's way early in the game, and physicists will tell you that biological systems like cells and then brains are incomparably more complex than something like gravity. But no, some philosophers, and religionists say there's something more to it. There must be something more. Can't just be material, must be spiritual. We heard that about life, okay? There was some ethereal force that can only animate matter. Matter itself can do it. There had to be some life force, elan vital, that animated mere matter to make life. Nobody believes that claim anymore. Life is a process, and matter in the right configurations can be alive. And my bet is that consciousness and conscious experience is going to be something just like life, that the right configurations of neurons can easily perform, okay, what we experience as consciousness and conscious experience. I have at least a couple of episodes on the details of that stuff later. Let's look at something else. Here's the little 2 millimeter C. elegans worm, just barely visible to the naked eye, right? It only takes 300 neurons to run its simple behavior. It doesn't see, hear, think, walk, speak, or run, or fly, right? Just 300 neurons and 7,000 connections. This thing can swim, it can smell, eat, defecate, reproduce, and not much more. Kind of like your roommate in college. Remember? That's all it could. Yeah. Okay. A clever raven, a much more complex thing than C. elegans worm, has about 2 billion neurons. A dog, about 3.5 billion. Our closest genetic relative, our DNA cousins, the chimp, has about 28 billion neurons. Remember, we have 83 billion neurons and way more connections between the areas than a chimp or any other animal. 83 billion required to run our behavior, speak, perceive, think, feel, conceptualize, theorize, right? And these, as of yet uninvestigated levels of complexity, right, could well be up to the task without need of some spiritual something else that the religionists and some philosophers propose has to do the real work. Yet they never seem to explain just what that is or how it might work, but again, more on that later, definitely. So that's our first taste of the complexity of the human brain. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button if you do like anything you're seeing here. Support us on Patreon if you can. The Dunn store is up in the link. You can get a deeper dive into these subjects on my companion site, Dispatches from the New Enlightenment at wearedone.org. There's going to be a link to that in the description. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook at unbelievingscum. That's also my email. And there's an Amazon link to my book. So have a great day. See you soon. And just think about it. The brain is you. And we'll talk about that later too. Adios.